Welcome. And with us today, I have Jennifer Pepito. Jen, thank you so much for being here today.
I'm so excited to be here, Cheryl. I've so enjoyed reading your Instagram posts and watching your work. It's been so inspiring.
Likewise. And you just sent me your book, which I can't wait to get into, but The Inspired Homeschool. So I can't wait to talk about that with you. But before we do that, what even got you into homeschooling in the first place?
Yeah, I started almost 30 years ago. I had my first child in 1993, and I was just really intentional about parenting. I was so excited about it and reading all the stuff. And before it was even time for her to go to school, I had decided that we were going to homeschool. And I remember my sister, her daughter initially started in a garden school. And my sister-in-law initially started in like a local preschool. And pretty soon my whole family, like there's 5 children in my parents have 5 children. So most of us homeschooled our kids most of the time. And I just love that we've had this family culture around that. I think that one of the things that really made me intrigued by homeschooling is we went to church with some families, and so some of the families I most loved the way they interacted, most loved the relationships between the parents and kids were homeschool families. And so I think seeing how homeschool families are just often so much more connection and love and enjoyment of each other inspired me to want more of that in my own family.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can definitely see that. So this was the 90s. Did you feel at the time like it wasn't that popular, or was it like, oh, well, we have our church community, lots of people do it?
Yeah, I didn't really care that much. Like my parents had pulled me out of school in junior high in the 80s at some point because they'd listened to Raymond Moore on Focus on the Family. And so my parents were always kind of like, don't be in the system, or they were always a little countercultural that way.
I like them
So
already.
yeah, you would like them. And so I wasn't too concerned about what people thought of me. And then we did early on find a church community that was very much aligned. Like it was basically this big hippie homeschool church. Most people were homeschoolers. Most people, like a lot of people were having home births, and it was a really easy place to get started then because there were some wonderful older moms who really were willing to speak into our lives as younger moms. I'm so grateful for that season in my life and my parenting. It set up the trajectory for our family in so many beautiful ways.
You know what kind of struck me as you were saying that? You said, a church group with hippie moms, which it's funny because I see that now, but when I typically think of like church and Christianity in the 90s, I do not think of the hippies as being part of that. What was that? I mean, today I can. Post COVID, where it was like there was like the Rage Against the Machine prior that was raging against the machine, and now they are whatever the machine tells us we'll do. So, but like, you had those hippies before that didn't like big pharma, but now it seems like those are the people that are like, no, if they have a white coat and they tell you to inject it in yourself, go ahead and do that. But we don't like any other capitalist.
Right. And these weren't those hippies. These were more like trad wife patriarchy, like long skirts and long hair and no makeup, but just very much about family and about raising your own kids, like passing on values to your kids. So hippie in terms of drinking raw milk and raising their own food and wearing, used clothes or whatever, but not hippie in terms of burning their bras and protesting against the establishment.
Okay. All right. No, I'm glad that you like made that disconnect, I guess, between the two, because it always intrigued me. Like, how did we go from one to the other? And maybe it was that they were always kind of separate, but I lumped them in until I was part of them. And then I'm like,
Yeah,
oh,
I'm
what are
surprised too,
hippies?
Cheryl, because so many of the people, like my mother-in-law was more of that kind of hippie, like the Rage Against the Machine. She protested NAFTA, which I think probably was a good thing to protest, honestly. But then, and she passed away before COVID. But I think it was a lot of those people who were very idealistic and against like big corporations that then did weirdly line up and trust big governments. I didn't understand that at all. I was very very astounded by that.
Crazy psychological experiment that we were all a part of. So,
Yes.
how many kids do you have?
I have seven. Their ages
Oh my goodness.
32 to 17. And my youngest, my wonderful youngest son, is away working at a Christian camp this summer doing whitewater rafting and rock climbing. And so I am like, it's quite a new season because I still have an adult son living in like a exterior apartment that we own and rent out, and then I have an adult daughter with disabilities and a 19-year-old daughter at home. But it is like this weird season of kind of in between.
Yeah, because you're not actually homeschooling right now,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
he'll be a senior next year, so we've just been talking about that because we live in California. Do you live in California?
No, New York, so
New York.
equivalent.
Okay, similar. Yeah. So we
Just
live in
crappier weather.
California. Yeah, where there's charter schools. So in high school, he did a public charter school for a couple years because I do like my high schoolers to have lab science. I like them to have passionate math teachers. Those are two things that I'm not good at teaching. And so we did those at this public charter school. So next year will be his senior year. And the only classes he still needs are American government, which I don't really trust a charter school to teach, and Spanish, which I can teach. And there's one more, English literature, which I can also teach. And so hopefully we'll just homeschool, or maybe he'll take a couple of college classes. We haven't decided. Anyhow, next year will be his senior year. So his last year, and he just has a few classes left.
Yeah, I can imagine that for doing it for 30 years, that's really like, I don't know. You're obviously moving forward with the next chapter of your life because you're writing books and, now welcoming yourself into kind of like helping us with the younger kids into this process. So let's go back to, what was it like homeschooling seven? There's a lot of people listening that are probably like, how do you even do that? How do you have all the different levels and manage seven kids and educate them at the same time?
Yeah. And a big part of our story is we were missionaries in Mexico for 4 years of those, of our 30 years of homeschooling. And that was when we moved down there when we had 5 kids who were like 11 and under. And then we came back when our oldest was like 15, and so maybe she was a little bit older than 11 when we moved, but anyhow, she was 15. We came back and we birthed a baby while we were down in Mexico, and then we had another one right after we came back. So we were doing like Charlotte Mason style homeschooling, but also we were moving, we were serving in orphanages, we were camping in San Felipe, we were traveling back and forth from Northern California to see family. So we had a lot of interrupted school days, a very interesting school experience, because part of the time we were like building a house in Mexico, and part of the time we were taking this cool field trip out to see New England. So we had a lot of experiences in our homeschool, but I did early on have a very clear vision. I write about that in the Inspired Homeschool, about how, when you know what's important to you, then you can curate the homeschool of your dreams. And thankfully, I didn't have the internet. Like, I remember, I think when we finally came back from being missionaries, I had like a dial-up internet or something really slow. And so most of the time homeschooling, I didn't have that distraction. I could really focus on enjoying my children in the mornings and reading to them. And I would bring like a big bowl of apples out in the mornings and I'd read out loud to them. And then we'd do some math and language arts, and just had this really sweet atmosphere that was it was very easy to just enjoy it and be fully present. Sometimes as a mom who was young and sometimes a little bit immature, I did some of that comparison. I did that. I did some of that, wishing my homeschool room was more beautiful or whatever. But my oldest daughter, it ended up going to like graduating summa cum laude from a state school and then going to university, getting a Juris Doctorate. And so early on, she's my oldest child. Early on, all those worries of like, am I doing enough, were pretty taken care of, because I knew how I'd homeschooled her, and it was somewhat haphazard even. Lots of books read, lots of discussions, a great work ethic. But because we were moving and I had a special needs daughter and I had a bunch of other children, an emergency C-section, I had all these other interruptions to my life, it was never perfect. It was never all these perfect homeschool days and these full long days and absolutely perfect everything. And she still was able to grow up and get a Juris Doctorate, and she's going to pass the bar this summer. So I think that definitely cured me of that self-doubt, because I could see, wow, children are learners if they're motivated. they can learn. And to some degree, we just have to create the right conditions for learning.
Yeah. And it's so easy to fall into the like, well, we didn't spend 2 hours on schoolwork today. And even that, they say isn't a lot because kids are in school for 6 hours. But I know we never spend 2 hours even on schoolwork. My son will be 8 in a couple weeks. So he's technically like finishing up his second grade year and my daughter's only 3. So I'm like, all right, we'll get in some math and we get in some like formal reading instruction from an online program. Reading Horizons, it's actually been around for like since, I don't know, the 80s or 90s. But it's definitely not every single day. But what I do have with them every single day is I try to read to them every day. And discussion, like we're like doing that. For instance, just now, I just came in I was fishing with him, or he was fishing, and I was just kind of standing there and taking some videos because I don't touch the fish or anything like that. But, he's 7 years old, and he caught 5 fish in the neighbor's pond, and he's rehooking the worms. He's taking the fish out of there. And I'm like, all right, I think I am doing enough because I know I don't know how to even do this stuff. And right now he's outside filleting the fish with my husband. So I guess what I'm asking is like, and you kind of reiterated it, but when we look at the whole, all second graders should know how to read like, this many words per minute or this many, but like how important is that stuff? Or, how to do this much math by the end of second grade or 5th grade? How important is that as your daughter, graduated summa cum laude?
Yeah, well, I think partly we just have to look at progress because, in the Finnish schools, they didn't even teach reading until age 7 or 8. And still they had really high scores, educational scores. And I think that what's happening in our American schools is that they're pushing academics earlier and earlier. Like kindergarten used to be about play and cutting, and maybe you learn your letters in kindergarten. You didn't have to learn to read in kindergarten for sure. And they pushed it earlier and earlier. But many studies show that all the gains even out by junior high. And so if your child learns to read in grade 4 or learns to read in grade 1, it all evens out. And when you're reading to your children and discussing the books, there'll really be no delays because the only reason to learn to read earlier is so you have a little bit more time to build that vocabulary and build the critical thinking skills that comes from reading and build the imagination that comes from reading and build the composition skills that comes from reading. But if you have a family habit of reading aloud or a family habit of listening to audiobooks, then those gaps will be filled. And so you really don't need to worry about, is my child reading yet at 7 years old? You just work on progress. Like I believe in consistent progress. Consistently review the phonograms, consistently read aloud, consistently do some math. But I don't think we need to be filling our children's days with tedious workbooks and feeling all this pressure to keep up with the public schools. The public schools are not doing a great job. Like so many kids are, graduating without real literacy or not really knowing how to enjoy a book or read a book or have any character or virtue. And I think there are more important things for children than being a skilled reader in the early years if the sacrifice is connection, joy, learning to enjoy learning, like your son, learning those motor skills. Like if he can track a fish on a hook or a knot on a hook, if he can track those things, those will strengthen his ability to read. Whereas if you were excluding that and you're like, oh, you didn't finish your homework, you got to stay in here and do more homework, you're not going to go fishing because that's too fun, you're actually sacrificing some really important development that will help him be a better reader. So good job, Mama, for making that choice.
Oh, that really warmed my heart because he definitely did not finish his reading assignment. He pulled a whole like, I think I have to throw up, Mom. I have to go lay down. And I'm like, it's just because I asked you to sit, do your reading. But yes, and then lo and behold, a couple hours later, we're out fishing. Yeah, and I think even just back to like survival skills, like these are things I did not ever grow up learning in school. And when I think of school, I feel like there were times throughout my career in the education system that I was like, I really want to be smart, but I honestly don't know how to get there. I wanted to know things, but then you open a textbook and you start reading and you fall asleep. It was just like, I don't even know it. Or I'd turn on the news because I'm like, well, they say watch the news. And I'm like, well, I have no idea what they're even talking about. Like, can I get news 101 or like news for dummies? So I even know what these broadcasters are talking about. And then, now I look at it and I'm like, it was probably good I didn't watch the news. But isn't it funny that like even kids that wanted to be smart still kind of like couldn't get there in the school system. Did you do family style learning with your kids? We're like, hey, we're going to learn all about, springtime or, caterpillars together, but we'll all have different levels. Or like, how did you manage getting it done with all the kids? Or was it really just kind of like we're learning through life, like a more unschooler approach?
No, I'm definitely not an unschooler. I'd be more in the Charlotte Mason camp. And so we did do family style learning though, where I would read, we did history in cycles. So we would do world history, ancient history, European history, and American history. And so in the Peaceful Press, we have cycles for all of that. So each year we'd have a different history focus. And that's kind of how we, formed our year. And then the science that we studied that year would often go along with it. So it's like if we were studying American history, we might be studying machines to go with industrialization, or we might be studying minerals to go with the gold rush. And so a lot of the science, language, poetry, art, a lot of that was coinciding somewhat with our history. And then we would just gather together in the morning. We would read the Bible, we'd sing, we'd look at art, we would read literature, we'd read some history. And meanwhile, the kids would be either maybe drawing timeline cards, coloring or writing in a map, writing a notebook page. So there was a lot of their own levels of production. So I could read something that might be a little bit over the heads of the youngest ones, and they could still draw a picture about it. And then the older ones would be writing a more involved essay or writing a more involved notebook page or drawing a more involved picture. So it was easy to adapt. And I don't feel like, sometimes for sure the information might have been a little heavy. Like I read The Hiding Place out loud to all of my children, and we might have had some preschoolers or early elementary wandering around. I don't remember that ever was a problem for them. We read the Chronicles of Narnia, so there was definitely a wide age range to listen to these stories, but we've never seen that was a problem for the younger ones. But what it did do is create this like rich family culture around books and imagination. And my daughter actually credits like even going to law school, having the imagination to go live overseas and go to law school as part of the result of all of the great books and biographies and memoirs and stories we read of people who did amazing things.
Okay, so as you're reading, are you the one reading the story even to the older ones that know how to read?
Yes. And, partly I looked at it as developing a culture of learning. So even, I had actually a rule because at some point my high school students were taking college classes or they had jobs. And so my rule was that if you're home in the morning, if you're not already to college class or you're not already working, then you also join our morning time. Because also morning time was like, if you were in a monastery, for instance, or you were in a boarding school, like if you were in some other situation, there would be usually a mandatory meeting of some kind, And so to me, it was like a mandatory family meeting. And I think it's tragic that so many people who homeschool through high school automatically let go of those family meetings. And then the problem is kids are lonely. Like high schoolers do need connection. Maybe they don't like you very much. Maybe you're not their favorite person to connect with, but you could become a better person to connect with if you would insist on, hey, let's get together. Let's talk about this. Tell me your thoughts on this book. Like we had some really great discussions, and I would also have my older ones lead sometimes in that. Like they might be the ones who played their guitar and sang for our morning singing time, or they might be the ones who read the Bible for us, or we might take turns reading poetry and having them contribute. So I would have them contribute and take some leadership role sometimes, because I did have, high school, even sometimes there might be a college student around in the morning who would come to that family meeting. And so it was like it was more of I would compare it in some ways more to like a church service than necessarily a class. Because the thing is, we think about classes nowadays as like only to first graders, and we did do this little dumbed down lesson. And then, it's like even in church Sunday school, they do these cartoons for little kids and they have to do a puppet show. Everything has to be so big, but kids have a better attention span and will develop an even better one if we give them a chance. And so this gave my younger children a chance to develop a deeper intellect and deeper learning. So it's not lacking in rigor. This like Charlotte Mason literature-based education, it's not lacking in rigor. It's just that you're discussing things together. So it also builds connection. It builds a family culture. Like we developed a culture around these stories we read. I remember one of my, like a very fond memory of parenting. My husband and I had gone out for the day. We were on a date or something, and we'd left our son, who was maybe somewhere between 12 and 14. Like, I don't think he was that old. We'd left him babysitting his little brother and sister, who might have been like 4 and 6 or 6 and 8, something like that. And we came home and they were all in our tree house and he was reading Tolstoy to them. And so like, it's such a gift. Like the books that my children have read have really shaped their imagination. They're very brave as adults. And I think it is in large part to just being raised on the idea that people in history have done great things, have done brave things, have had adventures. And we did read a lot of adventure stories. And so they can be adventurous too.
That's so cool. You mentioned the Peaceful Press, and this is your curriculum. Is that correct?
Yes, it's we just are celebrating 10 years this month. So 10 years ago, I had been homeschooling already for 20 years, and because we had a daughter with special needs, I really started studying occupational therapy and child development and neurodevelopmental therapy, and I realized that a lot of homeschool curriculum was really just copying the boxed public school curriculum, which is honestly pretty anti-child. Like if you have to medicate a child to get them through a school day, that's anti-child. And so, doing some of that research, I realized that most children need a lot more motor skills development than they're getting in school. And so my first resource was the Peaceful Preschool, which is a preschool resource that does teach letters and numbers, but also really strengthens and reinforces those large and fine motor skills, along with some practical life skills, which also build those motor skills.
Okay, but that wasn't your curriculum, right? The
Peaceful
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 That is
Preschool
yours.
was
That's
me.
where you started.
Yes, that was the first one.
All right. So you're developing this as your daughter you saw what she needed and then you're using it and then you're developing kind of the rest of the years as you're going. Can you tell us because I do get that question a lot. Like I would love to homeschool, but I have a child with special needs. So people feel like they have to push them into the system as if they're going to get the services that they actually need in the system. But when I talk to people whose children are in the system and need the services actually are not really available, or they have to go through so much testing that it's like missing the mark.
And this was a long time ago. This was like, because she's 30 now. And so she's one of my older homeschool kids. And it was a little scary sometimes because homeschooling was new enough that, we were going to neurologists because she was having seizures and having motor problems. And so there was I did have some nerves about it, but one of the neurologists was like, well, I have no problem with homeschooling. I wrote that in my journal. I was so happy, But what I found is that homeschooling is actually a lot healthier for kids who are on the spectrum, kids who, and I think there can be exceptions to that. Obviously, if your family atmosphere is so chaotic that you're not going to meet their needs. But we were using something called the neurodevelopmental approach. And so we would meet with someone every 3 months and she would give us a list of activities that would strengthen those motor skills. And that is what we incorporated into the Peaceful Preschools. A lot of that, like visual tracking, auditory awareness, motor skills, fine and large, brain coordination, and all of that can easily be done at home, often easily with the practical things you're already doing. Things like organizing the socks or swinging on a swing. All of those things really help with brain coordination. And a child's going to have a lot more of a chance of getting that attention and care at home than they are in a special needs classroom with 10 other kids, many of whom also have really intense behavioral issues.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. And then how did you develop it? Like what took you from I'm homeschooling my kids, but now I want to make a curriculum. Like, were you not finding exactly what you wanted? So you decided to just develop it? How did that unfold?
Yeah. So the preschool, I had seen that there really wasn't something out there that included those important motor skills. So that was the first curriculum I wrote. But then also I loved the idea of Charlotte Mason homeschooling. And at the time, there wasn't much besides Ambleside Online, which is a wonderful free resource. It's wonderful. But it was really hard. I had 7 kids. And so they've worked now on a groups option, but at the time they didn't did not have that groups option. And so trying to figure out like which year do you do? And then a lot of the books are really old. Some of them are wonderful, but some of them are a little more tedious for they weren't our interests. As well, we had this vision for family mission. So I loved reading a little bit more like some multicultural books or some biographies of missionaries, things like that. And the other so I wanted to write something that would pull families who were the same as me. They wanted to do something like Ambleside Online, but it was too complicated pulling all the pieces together and printing everything out. And so I created like an all-in-one. The Playful Pioneers was the first one, and it's based on the Little House on the Prairie books as a spine. And then you read all these wonderful history, like American history picture books and nonfiction as you go through the year. And then, but I included the art, I included the poetry, I included the handcrafts, because it was those things that were doing me. And as a mom, like I could get to reading and math and some language arts, but then I wasn't getting any handcrafts in, or I wasn't getting any art done, or we weren't reading any poetry. And so just having it all in one very easy, visually, very comfortable parent guide helped me. And I know it's helped thousands of other families as well. But the other reason, so I wanted something more simple for Charlotte Mason families. The other thing is I had family members who were doing classical conversations, which is, very great structured program. Like if you don't know anybody and you want to find a homeschool community, that is a really easy way to do it, because there, if you find a good campus with some good teachers, it really depends on the campus. It's like a simple, easy little program, kind of pricey. But the problem is the people that I knew who were doing classical conversations, then they weren't reading aloud to their kids, and they weren't looking at art, and they weren't doing handcrafts, except for the very, very simple ones they do it at co-op or at the campus. So Playful Pioneers was also written so that like all of my Peaceful Press history cycles are in a 3-year history cycle, which is how classical conversations, they have year 1, 2, and 3. So they match the history cycles of classical conversations. And they are also 4 days a week. So any family who's also doing a once a week co-op can easily use the Peaceful Press. Now, you could also use that 4th day or that 5th day of the week to just clean your house or take a field trip. Lots of great reasons to homeschool just 4 days a week.
Okay, so the Peaceful Press, it's literally every subject. It covers everything. Or do people have to add in a math or a science?
Yes. Yeah. I don't write math curriculum, so they have to add in a math, and they need to add in like grammars, phonics, or spelling. So there's a lot of language arts included, but in the early years, you might add Explode the Code to just reinforce the phonics, or you might add in, Institute for Excellence in Writing to reinforce grammar. Your dog wants to be on the podcast.
Yeah, he's not supposed to be down here. Hold on 1 second. I had him locked in the sunroom, but there are these like little window sills. They don't have anything in them. They're just kind of like shelves, and he must have jumped through them.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
Okay, so we'll get back to the math and science and grammar. Okay, yeah, so I do use Explode the Code with my son. I know exactly what that is, and it's a very cute little like supplemental program.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. What about the science?
Okay, so science is included. And there was an author named Jay Weil who wrote the Apologia Science curriculum, which was kind of the homeschool curriculum that every homeschooler used, especially literature-based homeschoolers in the day. And what he taught, he was a nuclear physicist or something, and what he taught is that you don't teach science through textbooks until, I think he said at the beginning, high school. Since then, the company that produces his books, Apologia, also has like an elementary science curriculum. But the point of that is that in the early years, and when you look at the lives of scientists, it's very true for scientists, there should just be a lot of experimentation happening, like, building things, building Legos, building Connects, building, any kind of building, any kind of project should be emphasized in the early years, along with reading stories about science concepts. So in the Peaceful Press, we include lots of projects. At least once a week, there's some kind of project, from making a windmill or a water wheel or baking bread, planting a garden, so many life science, physical science projects, along with beautiful picture book stories about scientists, about, the moon, the phase of the moon, or about books like Nature Anatomy. Things like that are included as our science through the elementary years.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm thinking of like you writing this, and it seems so overwhelming to like make sure that you include every subject and this and that. But what I also try to think about and tell people that are just looking into homeschooling is that like the subjects intertwine. It's not like you're taking, 39 minutes for math and 39 minutes for writing and 39 minutes for reading and 39 minutes for geography and 39 minutes for science. Like in history, it's like, no, we're kind of like talking about the moon, but we're reading about it, and then we might be writing about it, and then we might be doing like a science experiment about it, and maybe we're doing history as far as like, well, what did they used to think of what the moon did and what its purpose was, and like how did that change over time, and different cultures, what did they think of it? So you're really kind of including all of these subjects. Is that sort of what the Peaceful Press does?
Yeah, and we don't try to be too obvious or too, like, Charlotte Mason had a problem with people going to any great lengths to create unit studies, but really children make so many connections when you read The Playful Pioneers and Pa's going down into he's like digging the well, and then that guy passes out because there's bad gas in the well, and then we make an experiment about the lack of oxygen, how it puts out a candle, and then maybe that same week you do some kind of like looking at rocks, or maybe you bake something, or we made dirt cups as one of our like recipes for the week. And so there are these like small connections that happen that just expand the story and make our children so engaged with it. And I think that joy is this important component of learning. When you look at neuroscience, many neuroscientists talk about how joy sparks learning, whereas fear and stress and anxiety squash it. And so the more fun we can bring into our learning, the better for our kids. The more they're going to be excited about their own rabbit trails, the more they're going to be engaged with the subject matter. And so there is a lot of like real delight in the Peaceful Press resources through those connections.
Yeah. And then, so like, how do you do the literature? Do you say like, this is the book list, see if your library has these books, or order them from your library, or, you can purchase them here?
Yeah. I wish I had one of the curriculums here to show you, but I'll send you a sample you can link in the show notes. So basically there's a weekly grid, and in the weekly grid, it will tell you our elementary resources have a Bible component people can use or not use. So there'll be a Bible or devotional book to read out of. There'll be a chapter. So it's usually like a chapter a day of whatever the book is. Then there'll be a language arts activity. So it might be copying a quote or copying a poem, or like writing your own sort of part about an Aesop's fable. So there'll be some kind of a writing project. Then there'll be history or science. So we loop history and science. So it might be reading about somebody in history and they're making a notebook page or a timeline figure. It might be filling in a map. And then there'll be a space in the grid for you to write in what you did for math and what you did for phonics, spelling, or grammar. And then we loop through the beauty subjects. So Mondays we look at art. Tuesdays we do one of those projects. Wednesdays we do a nature walk. And Thursdays we do a recipe or baking. So it makes a really beautiful rhythm, but everything is laid out for you in a daily plan. And then you just write down what math lesson, because it's an all-in-one family style curriculum. If you are trying to teach math to a bunch of ages at once, that doesn't necessarily work. Although I do believe in combining close ages. And you can't necessarily, a first grader might need phonics and a sixth grader might need a grammar lesson, but you certainly can read the same books and have them all notebook at their level. You certainly can look at the same art and have the different children, the older ones and the younger one, give you their ideas or their impressions of the art. You can read the same poetry to all of them, and you can make the same recipes and do the same projects. Obviously, an older child, if they're doing a project that involves like a tin can lantern, for example, an older child's going to have an easier time. The younger one's going to need a little more help. But it just becomes part of your family culture, this atmosphere of learning and creativity and just absorbing so many beautiful ideas.
Yeah, I love that. So how long does it take to get there? Like when you tell me a typical day, from the time that the kids wake up, or even you wake up, because I'm sure there's stuff to get done before everybody else is up.
Yeah, I love that day in the life. In the Restoration Home community, we talk a lot about our morning habits. So for me, I would get up. I was breastfeeding or having, I had a baby for a lot of those years, but I would get up in the morning. I would try to do a little bit of Bible reading. and maybe some chores or something. And then I would start saying, make your bed, brush your teeth, clean your room, read your Bible. Or I'd start saying something like that as like a little morning call to the children, because they might wake up a little bit earlier than me or a little bit later. But at some point, usually around 9 o'clock in the morning, we would have had breakfast and we would start our morning time. And then we'd do that for like an hour, hour and a half. Then we'd have about an hour of language arts or an hour of math. We'd usually do math first. And teaching math when you're homeschooling multiple ages can be pretty intense, because you're, trying to like go to the different levels and help different people with the problems they're having problems with. So those were some of the hardest moments, is probably that math hour. And then we'd have an hour of language arts, which might have been filling in like an Explode the Code workbook. Maybe I would have given them a spelling test. It might have been doing a rough draft for Institute for Excellence in Writing lesson. And then in the afternoon, we would be free for projects or maybe music lessons, or a lot of the time they would just play outside in the afternoons. We had really made it that ambition because our family was so into living in the country and having growing some of our own food. My daughter had a horse. And so because that was our lifestyle, we spent a lot of afternoons just like playing in the yard, playing by the creek, instead of running around in the car.
Yeah. And I just posted about that today. I was like, talking to people who've homeschooled, one of the biggest regrets is overloading that schedule, because you think that you're not giving your kid enough. But really, when you look back at it, it's like, man, I wish we kind of had relaxed a little bit more and just enjoyed those backyard afternoons.
Yeah, I think, every family is so different, and people's tolerance and people's children's, like some kids need a lot more social activity and some need less. And so I think the main thing is knowing yourself and your kids, because you've got to have enough margin. Like, some of the worst times for me as a mom was when I was overscheduled and I was trying to get all the kids in the car for choir practice or something, and then yelling at them because I couldn't find the baby's shoes, or, it's like these moments where it's just so intense usually happened when we were a little bit too rushed. So I think the main thing is make sure you have enough margin that you can do everything with peace.
And how did you deal with when like the kids just didn't want to do, the morning time and the math hour and the language arts hour? I mean, out of 7 kids, you must have had some pushback at some point in time, especially if they haven't been to the traditional school system. It's not like you can hold that over your head like, I'll send you back. You know how bad that was.
Yeah, I never used that threat. We started our family in the 90s in a very kind of strict authoritarian parenting style. And so early on, we taught our kids to obey us, and we never untaught that. So we never, we became more relaxed as parents later on, and, our values changed a little bit. So I would say the hardest student I had to homeschool was my youngest, because we had become so much more relaxed. Like if the older ones, we did a lot of like practicing. Like we would practice just sitting quietly on a couch somewhere. There was no phones or devices. We would go to weddings, we'd go to church, they'd sit with us in church. So they actually had a lot of practice sitting. And I think it is something important to practice with your kids, because you can't always have a device in your hand when you're bored. You know what I mean? I think it's so easy for modern parents. As soon as a kid gets fidgety or bored, they just stick a device in their hands. But it's not a super good practice, because then they're always overstimulated. They're always expecting to be that stimulated. And it is good for kids to learn to sit quietly and be bored. But, so with the older ones, we taught them to sit still, and it wasn't that hard to do morning time. Now, with the youngest, I think there was a lot more chaos in our family. Like we had 7 kids, there was adults coming and going. And I think that also because I was a little bit more ambivalent in a way, we'd had our oldest daughter had an eating disorder after she'd been on some heavy antibiotics for a climbing accident. She'd gotten an infection after a rock dropped on her. So there was a lot that went into that season in our lives, but it really shook me up as a parent. It made me less confident about being sort of the authority in my kids' lives. And so it took me a little while to get back, to get healed from that, because I think our children feel much safer and much happier when we are in charge. I think it's very scary for kids when you as the mom are unwilling to enforce any boundaries. And so that experience, like I did experiment with my youngest child with like saying yes to everything and being a little bit more hands off, but I feel like that was hard on him. And so he was the only one who was a little bit harder to homeschool. Like he would be more fidgety, or he would have like not wanted to sit still for as long, things like that. But I still just followed through. Like I would say, okay, because at first I was thinking, okay, he's a boy, and so he just needs to move more, and we'll do more phonics activities while hopping, or we'll practice other ways. But then I started to realize, like, oh, this kid is just so smart. He's playing me like a fiddle, and I need to enforce a little bit more boundaries with him for his own sake, because he's really smart, and it's not fair to him to have him, not be able to write legibly because I didn't reinforce him sitting there and writing legibly. So there was a point where with this child, I would just like, okay, you have to write at least one word. And if he didn't do it willingly, I would just hold his hand and write the word with him holding his hand, and so there was more of those struggles, but I think the struggles would have been less if I'd just been more consistent with that child earlier. So if you're listening right now and you have young children, don't be afraid to be the boss. Like, don't be afraid to say, this is and start in small increments. Like, children are capable of so much more than we think. And it doesn't have to be this big, scary, authoritarian thing. It's more about consistency. Like if you consistently have, everyone sits down for one picture book a day, then later on you can add a chapter book. But if you don't enforce any kind of order, it's going to be really hard to homeschool. And it's a little disservice to the teachers to send them off to school. Like they've never sat through a meal with you. They've never gone to bed when you told them. They've never read a story on their own. Like if you have no ability to direct your children, it's going to be hard to homeschool, and it's going to be hard for them in life. Really, if they're unwilling to listen to anybody in authority, it's going to be hard for them to get a job, to go to college. Like I think we're doing our kids a disservice when we don't teach them at all to follow somebody's instructions. And you look at the thing that really changed my heart about this, Cheryl, because I was like, maybe I was reading things like Love and Logic or whatever, and like maybe we should just let people make their own choices. And what really changed my heart, I read a little bit of Alfie Kohn. What really changed my heart, though, was reading the book Shackleton's Endurance, and it's an adventure story about this South Atlantic, Antarctic shipwreck, and this whole crew of men get shipwrecked, and they're out on the ice, and really they would die if they did not obey the captain. There was a captain of the expedition, and if these men did not obey the captain, they would 100%, 1000% die. And I thought, like, in a time of crisis, like it is hard for us as Americans to trust any authority. And then I think it's hard for us to be an authority. But really, if you want to make big progress in life, it does take knowing how to develop a team and have a leader. And so being willing as a mom to be a leader in your family and, to lead your children is going to give them leadership skills that might help them someday develop a team that really accomplishes something great. But if everybody's just an individual doing all their own thing and nobody's willing ever to submit to somebody else's will, it's going to be hard to accomplish those big things like saving yourselves from a shipwreck or building a rocket or whatever the big project might be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it even kind of makes me think about when you homeschool, a lot of the homeschoolers, it's like, let your child do dangerous things safely. And, but that's a hard line to kind of walk too. And I know my son, he's 7, he's got a dirt bike, he's got a 4-wheeler, and we have neighbors who, they go to public school, but like the kids, and they're 12, but they still get along really well. But here my 7-year-old is trying to kind of be at the level of the 12-year-old. So they're on like a 4-wheeler or a dirt bikes together. And I'm like, I didn't grow up this way. I grew up more in the city. So I know nothing about them. And it's hard to know the boundaries. Like, what is a logical boundary with something that could potentially kill a child? I struggle with that all the time of, they have to learn what's safe for them, but you also have an obligation as a parent to make sure your child stays safe as they're learning their boundaries. It's very hard.
It's so hard, Cheryl. There's a family that we know whose child was experimenting with making explosives. I don't know what.
Jeez.
This is part of the problem of the internet. Like experimenting with making explosives, and they blew their hands off. And it's like, I love my kids experimenting. I love, my daughter rock climbs. She climbs like multi-pitch big rocks in Yosemite. And it's so terrifying to me. She's taken some of my kids on climbs with her. But I think, for me, it partly is about discernment, just like, praying. I mean, what does it look like to be a leader in this situation? Is this a situation where I have to say, sorry, this is not going to be something we're going to participate in? Or is it something where I have to deal with my own fears and trust that they're going to be okay? And so I think everything's so individual, homeschooling, education. It's so much about what's important to your family, which is why for me, cultivating my relationship with the Lord is so important, because it does take like unnatural discernment. Do you know what I mean? Like, we either just obey what everyone tells us to do, do the normal thing, put them in school, put them in the classes, or, you have to have discernment. And there's danger in everything. Like there's, your kids could play sports and break their ACL or their leg or their neck, or, your kids could, yes, there's so many dangers in life, and just weighing that out and listening to your own gut, I think, is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as we wrap up, let's talk about your book a little bit. What made you want to write this? And it is called The Inspired Homeschool. What made you start this?
Well, I love history. It's one of my favorite subjects to teach. And I've noticed so many homeschoolers, like even families who want to use the Peaceful Press, like it sounds really fun to them to read more books to their kids and to do more projects. They love that idea, but then they get scared. They think, oh my gosh, but what if I'm not keeping up? Or like the public schools they're doing so many more hours a day of schooling, and this seems like too much fun. And so I just wanted those families to see how history was homeschooled, because historically people were not sitting in desks all day. Like the great minds in history had a lot more freedom to pursue their interests. They had a lot more time. They had a lot more creative outlets, and schools just stifle, like especially schools today. It's heartbreaking. Like not only do they take up your child's whole day, but then they send them home with homework as well. And it's busy work, and kids are growing up and graduating just so burnt out with no moral character and just like zombies. And I didn't, I wanted families to break free from that fear. And I think when you read The Inspired Homeschool and you see like all these people, and I had to narrow it down. There are so many people who historically were homeschooled and were brilliant. And so I had to narrow it down to, not so many people. And there's all kinds of stories, like people coming out of slavery, people who did not have a mother or a father, or people who, maybe they were homeschooled in their best years and then they had to be in boarding school for a little bit. So there's a wide variety of examples in there that you can apply to your own family, but just there's that hope that you don't have to do it the same way as the public schools, and that isn't historically the best way or historically the norm.
Yeah. And when I just think back to like my experience, I had no time to even figure out what I enjoyed doing in life. And my mother, she's almost 80, and she's like working in a library just because she doesn't know what else to do with her life, because she never really sat down and thought about her interests, what they could be. And the world is so endless with the possibilities of things that could bring you joy. But it's like she's just so ingrained to think like, well, if I don't have anything to do, I have to just sit and collect a paycheck. It's crazy. So I love this idea, and it is how history's heroes light a path toward joyful, confident learning. And of course, you have the key and the kite, and a few different examples right on the cover. I love that. What is like a message that you would like to send us off with today for parents who maybe are thinking of homeschooling but afraid to take the leap, or just started homeschooling but their kids are young, so they're not really delved in yet?
Yeah, I think really take the leap. And especially if you are someone, you're listening to this podcast and your kids have already been in public school for a little while. So maybe they have a foundation in language arts, or maybe they have a foundation in math, or maybe they're just like in tears all the time, and they're threatening to put them on a medication to get through school. Just take the leap. Just do like a sample of the Peaceful Press. You can go to inspiredhomeschoolbook.com and get our book list, get a free workshop. There's lots of free samples on there. But when you take a break from that, like institutional learning, and just explore a little bit with your kids, read books together, there's so much that is healed. Our nervous systems are healed. Like your children sitting under fluorescent lights at a desk all day, not the healthiest thing for their bodies. And so there's so much healing potential in bringing your kids home, even if it was just for 1 year. Like, you don't have to make a forever decision. Taking them out for a year, they're not going to fall behind. We've had lots of different stories of families who they homeschooled the Peaceful Press for a little while, and then their kids go to public high school, and there's no problem transitioning back. We found the same thing when our son went into the charter school. And so there's, you have, the world is your oyster, and it's not going to hurt you to take a year to just really love learning with your children and really enjoy being together as a family. But what could really help is developing those bonds, developing some joy, and really connecting as a family.
Yeah. And where can people find you if they want to check out your book or
Yeah.
the Peaceful Press?
Yeah, so you can go to thepeacefulpress.com, or if you go to inspiredhomeschoolbook.com, that's where you can get more information about the book as well as access those free pre-order bonuses. But thepeacefulpress.com, everything is there.
Awesome. I will link that in the show's description. Jen, thank you so much for being here today. This has been so interesting just to hear about your wealth of knowledge with, 30 years of homeschooling and even with, having a child with special needs, that it can be done. There's nobody that loves your child more than you do. You can offer them anything and you don't have to do it all yourself. There are other resources out there that can help you. And I really just, want parents to take that, leap that they're the best ones to do this.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for having me, Cheryl. What a delight to talk to you today.
You as well.